Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Spar and Brawl. I hope you're having a decent day. As always, I'm joined by my co-host Sam, but today we also have the honor of being joined by Professor Martin J. So, Professor Martin, thank you again very much for joining us. So I'm just going to give a quick introduction to you, and then we'll get it started. So Professor Martin J. is Sidney Hellman Ehrman Professor of History Emeritus at the University of California, Berkeley, where he taught modern European intellectual history and critical theory for 45 years. He's a renowned intellectual historian, and his research interests have been groundbreaking in connecting history with other academic and intellectual activities, such as the critical theory of the Frankfurt School, which we'll be discussing today. He's the author of many, many books, including most recently, Splinters in Your Eye, Essay on the Frankfurt School, as well as Reason After Its Eclipse on Critical Theory. But his most recent book is Genesis and Validity, the Theory and Practice of Intellectual History. So Martin, again, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
And so perhaps I should have just mentioned this in the beginning as well. So this interview is part of our Frankfurt School series. So if you've stumbled upon just this interview, you can go in the description box, and we have links to the series as well, where we interview other professors as well. So Martin, I thought with you, we didn't want to go all from the beginning of the Frankfurt School, but I thought before we get into the questions, you could perhaps tell us a little bit what you think are perhaps the most fascinating aspects about the Frankfurt School, or some of their main contributions.
This is a really hard question to give a soundbite answer to, precisely because the Frankfurt School was critical of the idea of condensing difficult thoughts into simple formulations. And so I would say, with a great caveat to begin with, that the Frankfurt School is not absolutely coherent. It doesn't have, even though the name school suggests it does, a kind of, let's say, curriculum with a mentor who runs the show. It basically is, and I would use the title of Herbert Marcuse's Festschrift, the critical spirit that informs a wide variety of approaches to what we might call the ongoing crisis of Western culture. More broadly than mere capitalism, Western culture going all the way back, they would argue, to the dialectic of enlightenment that begins with the domination of nature in a very early moment in the rise of human civilization. So it has great ambitions. It has lots of, I would say, targets. It has lots of theoretical impulses coursing through it, Marxism being the most obvious, but by no means the only one. And it has had several generations, so that any attempt to talk about the Frankfurt School comes up against the fact that it is an ongoing project with at least 3, perhaps 4 generations of theorists who have developed it in different ways. The other thing that I think has been most exciting about the Frankfurt School, it's now 50 years since I first got involved, is the extent to which it has exfoliated over those decades into an international movement with many contributions from outside of Europe and the United States, so that one has to really be very careful about giving an essential version of critical theory, because it has taken on so many different discourses, post-colonial, gender, queer studies, things that were not there at the beginning, and that nonetheless have been enfolded into, although often with some tension, the earlier contributions. So having, in a way, evaded your question in that way, I think what I want to do is give a sense of critical theory as not something that can be simply condensed. And one of the great, I would say, ironic stories is that in the past, now it's about 15 or 20 years, the Frankfurt School has been condensed in precisely this way as a right-wing meme. That is to say, the ways in which the Frankfurt School now has appeared in YouTube after YouTube presentation and a slew of absolutely terrible books as a kind of boogeyman for all of the evils, as they see it, of contemporary woke culture. So the Frankfurt School has, in fact, been a kind of a scapegoat in a way that I would like to avoid by also ducking the question of how we can simply reduce it to a series of specific elements or principles. I mean, the Frankfurt School meme does precisely that. They even have a list of what they call the 11, I think, or 10 or 11 principles of the Frankfurt School, very few of which have anything whatsoever to do with the actual historical Frankfurt School. So in a way, my plea here is to go slow when it comes to making sense of them. Read the original works if you can, but even the secondary sources like my own, and then you'll see the variety and the heterogeneity of the critical spirit, as I've described it, rather than reducing it to a few formulaic principles.
No, I mean, you're definitely right. I mean, especially us right now, I guess we're going to kind of focus on Marcuse and a little bit of Adorno, although there are some other questions, but you're right. I mean, there are just the fact that all the generations and the most recent ones, of course, and they're still continuing their work and going into different branches. And so perhaps we can get a little bit more into these questions. I mean, I personally came across Marcuse first at university with Eros and Civilizations, and I really, really enjoyed that book. But as well, now as I'm trying to read some Adorno and other works of theirs, and I've seen that when it comes to Freud, apparently they didn't all have the same relation, or throughout even the first 30 years, or thinking how they should include psychoanalysis. And just to be, I guess, fully transparent, even in Eros and Civilization, which is so based heavily on some of the concepts of Freud, I sometimes don't see personally too much the value of it in a way. And I could see that how if you just stuck to more just to Marxism, that could have also done the trick. So just what do you think perhaps about including Freud and then mixing it alongside the other social science disciplines?
Well, this is also a great question. I mean, it begins the Frankfurt School's use of Freud essentially with the coming of Erich Fromm to the Institute. Fromm, who had been friendly with Theo Löwenthal and knew several of the other members, joined the Institute in its earliest years, continued until the very late 30s when they the Institute had a kind of quarrel with him and he left. Basically, his interest in Freud, although he later watered it down, was an interest in the psychological mechanisms that helped to nurture or prevented the creation of a class-conscious working class. In the late 1920s, he was involved in a project survey which attempted to look at the revolutionary mindset of the workers, who theoretically were supposed to be radically militant, but practically were far more ambivalent. And he discovered, using techniques which perhaps were cruder than the ones that we would now feel as social scientists were appropriate, he discovered that they were far less psychologically prepared to be as rebellious as they had purported to be. And that therefore they were unlikely, at least in Germany, to produce the kind of resistance to Nazism or to fascism, broadly speaking, that was needed at the time. So one of the initial, I would say, uses of of Freud in critical theory was to explain the reluctance of the working class to fulfill its historical role, one assigned to it by Marxism. And the later studies of the authoritarian personality grew out of this understanding of the difference between ideological or, let's say, public discursive proclamations of a position and the deeper psychological workings of a let's say, negative or resistant kind. They were also very interested in the mediating role that the family played in moving from capitalism to the individual. That is to say, there was not simply a direct relationship between the ways in which the mode of production operated and individual behavior, but rather the bourgeois family in particular played a mediating role. Now, oddly, that mediating role was one that nurtured personalities that could, in fact, find some sort of resources to resist capitalism, as well as perhaps be, let's say, assimilated into it. And they worried about the erosion of the traditional family in producing that kind of resistance. So the family, as what was later called a haven in a heartless world, was in fact in danger. And even the role of the patriarchal father, the strong father who could be both distant and patriarchal in a bad sense, but also a source of a kind of, let's say, ego ideal, a strong individualism, a strong sense of personal, let's say, resilience, that was also being endangered. And the fear was that the erosion of the bourgeois family meant that both the state and capitalist relations through the marketplace, through advertising, whatever, could permeate the individual, robbing him or her of a kind of potential for resistance. So that was one of the sources of their interest in Freud. There were others as well, and one of them you've already mentioned, and I'll jump to this, in Eros and Civilization, is the idea that in psychoanalysis, in Freud at least, there were certain, let's say, hints of what true emancipation would look like. It was not simply emancipation from economic exploitation, from inequality, but also an emancipation which took seriously the claims of the body, the claims of desire, the claims of libido, the claims, in other words, of pleasure and happiness. And the Frankfurt School was always opposed to the ascetic current in Marxism, the current that said, well, we have to wait, we have to basically keep ourselves under control so that we can make a revolution. We have to deny. One that stressed productivism rather than consumerism, one that stressed the body as a weapon in a militant struggle rather than the body as a site of pleasure. So Eros and Civilization comes to the culmination of one thread in the Frankfurt School's use of Freud, which is the thread that stresses the rights, we might say, the needs of the body, the pleasure of the body, not sublimated, not distracted from its basic, let's say, needs or desires, but rather really fulfilled in a utopian way. So the Eros was part of the revolution. Eros was not something that was irrelevant to the revolution, but was ultimately at least part of its goal. And this also, Eros and Civilization also introduced a concept which was there in the Frankfurt School's work before, which is that of repressive desublimation. So yes, the body needs to be desublimated ultimately, but it also can be desublimated. That is, it can lose its sense of constraint in a channeled way in the service of a kind of, let's say, immediate gratification. And capitalism was clever enough to benefit from repressive desublimation, in which the immediate gratification, let's call it the Playboy philosophy, a la Hugh Hefner, could become a tool in the maintenance of the system rather than in the service of its undermining. So these were a number of the ways in which Frankfurt School interest in psychoanalysis developed. Now, what they did not like, Adorno in particular, was the role of therapy. So unlike, this is a very interesting dimension of it. Marx had argued for the unity of theory and practice. Freud also argued in a way for the unity of psychoanalytic theory and therapeutic practice. The hope was that individuals could be, quote, cured, or at least the neuroses could be dealt with through the application of psychoanalytic therapeutic techniques, which were rooted in the theory. The Frankfurt School was always very, let's say, reluctant to argue for the immediate unity of theory and practice. Ultimately, perhaps in the long run, yes, but not in the moment. So Marxist theory and revolutionary practice, radical theory and militant politics did not, in their understanding, necessarily go together in the present. That rushing the link was a mistake. And the same thing, in a parallel way, was true of their attitude towards psychoanalysis. So Adorno in particular was very hostile to the idea of therapy in the present, disliked the Freudian model of the cure because he thought it basically meant adjustment to the status quo. It meant making people happy in a kind of superficial way, making them, somehow able to deal with their neuroses, rather than looking at the larger psychosocial forces that created unhappiness in individuals. So these are various ways. I could go on and on. Another obvious way in which critical theory used psychoanalysis is the discovery or the discussion of the so-called authoritarian personality, which sometimes was taken, this was a work done in the late 1940s, published in 1950, trying to come up with a neutral technique, the F scale, to measure people's latent authoritarianism. It was sometimes argued that it was a concession entirely to psychological rather than social explanations of authoritarianism. Adorno and others argued against this, that it was basically social forces that permeated the individual, creating authoritarian personalities rather than anything latent in the psyche per se. But having said that, they understood that these social forces could use the techniques of psychological, let's say, psychological manipulation to create personalities that would be basically acquiescent in either, let's say, political or social conformity. So there was a kind of complicated relation between the social and the psychological, between sociology and psychology, between Marx and Freud. All of these, I mean, the metaphor of the marriage is often used. It was a marriage that was often, as marriages can be, contested. It was not simply harmonious. There was a sense of each of them bringing something to the table, but not producing a simple reconciliation, largely because the world they tried to make sense of was a world which was itself contested, contradictory, unreconciled, irreducible to a harmonistic totality. So the methods you used needed somehow to reflect precisely that tension. And psychoanalysis, therefore, was part of the mix, but was never fully and completely folded into a totally coherent and totally smooth theory.
I see that's very interesting. I mean, what you said about Adorno, that was also interesting, adjusting to the status quo through therapy. But I don't know if Sam has any follow-up questions. But in the beginning, you spoke about family, and then I just want to come back about authoritarian figures. But the family aspect, I had never heard about that. So I was wondering if you could just elaborate on that again, please.
Well, this is also historical. That is to say, it's not the family per se, but the bourgeois family, which emerges at a certain point in history, and then is under siege, which becomes permeated, we might say, by social forces which prevent it from being an enclave. The enclave theory is quite interesting. And Adorno himself, this is often, one of the things that explains his life history. Adorno had a very happy childhood, a nurtured childhood. He was a single child in a family with basically two mothers. His aunt, Agatha, was part of the larger family. And they spoiled him rotten. He was extraordinarily well taken care of. Everybody really loved him. Everybody really made a little utopia for him. And he often reflected on childhood as a moment of lost paradise. Walter Benjamin also, although he had much more difficulty with his parents ultimately, had very positive feelings about childhood. So one aspect of the family is the space in which happy childhoods can take place. Now, of course, we know that this is not true of every family. We also know that not every family is a single, mommy, daddy, spoiled children, nuclear, let's say, organization. Its families have many different forms. But this model of the family as a kind of enclave before the child has to become an adult and go out into the world is sometimes seen as a source of a kind of utopia. Now, as I say, it's not universal. There's something idealized about it and so forth. The other utopia, interestingly enough, and I recently wrote about this in the introduction to a book that came out in German of the materials that are left behind by Marcuse and Leo Löwenthal. The other utopia was friendship. So the model of friendship, which is not the model of kin, but the model, we might say, of kith, of a certain kind of relationship that is not impersonal, that is not transactional, a relationship that is one without desire, in the way sometimes love relationships are. The relationship of friendship is also, to a certain extent, a relationship that has utopian dimensions. And the Frankfurt School had, in fact, in its history, several extraordinary friendships. I mean, Horkheimer and Friedrich Pollock had a friendship pact that they wrote when they were very young, which they kept to throughout their entire life. They lived near the end of their lives in adjoining homes in Montagnola in Switzerland, remained friends throughout. Marcuse and Löwenthal, Marcuse and Franz Neumann, Horkheimer and Adorno, these were deep and really important friendships, not without some tensions occasionally, but still able basically to prefigure a kind of state of relationships that would be positive. So the family, in a certain respect, certain, let's say, historical constraints, the possibility of friendship, all of these represented ways of avoiding the public relationships, which relationships of exchange, relationships of instrumental reason, relationships that were transactional in the larger capitalist world into which we were, in a sense, thrust after we left the family, after we were thrown out into the world of getting and spending. So that was, I think, one of the sources of their, let's say, complicated relationship to what was being lost in the modern world and what could be seen as a resistant residue against the total permeation of all human relations by what they saw as the alienation and reification of capitalism.
I see. Okay, and it's very interesting. And it kind of, so in your first question, your first response, sorry, you said one thing that I hadn't thought of, and I thought that was very interesting. Is that Marcuse didn't want to just use Freud to explain perhaps why there hasn't been a revolution, but also, if I understood you correctly, he was trying to say that even if all our material needs were met, it doesn't mean that we would necessarily be happy, and we would need to have other forms of emancipation. Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah, basically, I mean, it's material in the broader sense. So it includes the human body, the desires of the body, and the body understood, because if we have to go into that, argument more seriously, the body understood in terms of polymorphous perversity rather than the division between the body as a laboring, disciplined tool and the body as a site in which, let's say, the organization of sexuality is confined to the genitals or other erogenous zones. So it's a kind of, perhaps cockeyed idea. Norman O'Brien also argues for it in Life Against Death, of polymorphous perversity, the body as inherently, let's say, libidinally chargeable. It isn't now, and it can't be under current circumstances, but the body as a site of more general pleasure. And this, what Adorno elsewhere calls blind somatic pleasure, becomes once again a model of a certain notion of extreme utopian happiness, in which we don't have to delay pleasure, we don't have delay gratification, we don't have to, somehow split ourselves into workers and people who then have a few moments of leisure. But at some point, and this is at least Marcuse's hope, technology will free the body, free humans to live lives of much greater pleasure. And it's a bit like the idea of Charles Fourier, the great French utopian, in which pleasure rather than labor becomes the model of utopia. Not even unalienated labor. Pleasure itself becomes the ultimate criterion of a utopian society. Now, how you cash this out, it's all very much utopian in the sense of the negative sense of the word is impossible to achieve, but at least it stood for Marcuse as a standard of what he was hoping might be achieved by a revolution.
Right. Yes, I see what you're saying. These are kind of thoughts that, for some reason, I would associate them with just broader leftist like ideas and thoughts, and not perhaps go into psychoanalysis and Freud. But I mean, and I guess you can see the roots of it. But I just also had one more question here, and this part I mean, you talked about the authoritarian figures and how who's an authoritarian leader and their study of that. But perhaps if we take like an example of Trump, does it really, when you want to look at the impact that he would have on the world and on the US domestically and everything, does it, I mean, sure, I can see how it helps explain a little bit Trump's individual actions, the kind of person he is, but beyond that, does it really have a kind of value as much as understanding the other social and political factors that shape the decisions of him and his administration, for instance?
Well, this is a very complex question. A lot of people have tried to apply various aspects of critical theory to explain Trump. And certainly the authoritarian personality argument has been used to make sense of why he's popular among certain people. Now, I've myself been a little reluctant to do this because I think it creates a kind of dangerous division that we're normal, we're rational, we're sane, they're nuts, that they're authoritarian personalities who are pathological. They're basically not acting rationally. They're basically not people we can argue with, we can't discuss. They're people who are outside the pale. And once you begin to demonize people as pathological, say Trump supporters as all basically being driven by some sort of irrational needs, then you've created a kind of, us versus them dehumanization of the opposition. So I'm not really much enamored of that argument. In fact, one of the essays I'm doing a book that's coming out called Imminent Critiques, deals with the authoritarian personality precisely in those terms. Now, having said that, they had another analysis, which I've been able to draw on, of so-called racket society. Now, this is something they did not come to fruition. They never published much out of this. But in the 1930s, they began to think of fascism not in terms of monopoly capitalism or in terms of even the authoritarian personality, but rather in terms of rackets. Now, what they meant by that was the regression, we might say, to a society in which protection and loyalty on a very personal transactional level was more important than impersonal forces like the rule of law or even like the marketplace. And so there was a relationship in which an individual, charismatic perhaps, or at least powerful figure, gained authority, not by the legitimation of law, not by people actually on some rational level voting or whatever the way in which their rational wishes were expressed, but rather because this powerful person provided protection, provided some sort of way of being hidden from the vicious, violent forces of society as a whole. So the racket society is one in which everything is transactional, everything is personal loyalty. And we see in the Trump figure, if we sort of extracted from him as an actual individual, a racketeer par excellence. I mean, he obviously engages, before he's a president, in practices which were outside the law. I mean, he's clearly a guy who's constantly using, this kind of, I help you, you help me. But also as a figure in politics, if you're loyal to him, he gives you protection. If you're not loyal, you're out. If you're not loyal, you're basically seen as a traitor. And you see this with people who were once his proteges, who are now, his opponents and so forth. So this relationship, the racket relationship, we see it obviously in Putin's Russia. I mean, this is a kleptocracy in which the rule of law is suspended and people who are loyal to him get away with it and the others don't. We see it in Bolsonaro. We see it, probably in Orban. A lot of these figures have a kind of capacity to rule through something that the racket model gives us some insight into. Now, whether this is all that Western society has become is probably not true. And, fascism was in a way defeated, not absolute terms or residues of it. And the rule of law and the marketplace haven't been entirely superseded. But the racket model gives us some insight to at least the tension in the way our society operates. And Trump exploited that and became a kind of gangster president, admired, as I argue in a piece that I did in the Los Angeles book review, the LA book review, that a review of books that basically operated in such a way that the model of the gangster in American popular culture, and I talk about the movie The Irishman, we think of other movies, The Godfather and so forth, becomes a hero, that we are in a way attracted to that kind of figure. There's something heroic about the Corleone family, or something heroic about the Sopranos. There's something weirdly attractive about them. And so the gangster figure has become in popular culture, but also, alas, in real politics, a significant force. And the Frankfurt School, though they never fully published or developed this idea, was on to something in the 1930s. And there's a recent book that's just come out in German by a man named Fuchshuber called The Rackets. I think it's called The Rackets, big fat book in German, which deals precisely with their underdeveloped but nonetheless still very provocative notion of rackets.
I mean, with the Trump example, it is so clear, and with the Putin one you gave as well. But could you not say that also someone like Obama, he's not that clear in the way that he behaves? Okay, if you don't do what I want, or if you're not on my side, then you become my enemy. But him too, and his kind of administration would not perhaps put up with people who wouldn't be loyal to him and his administration.
I'm sure this is true of all political power, that there is certain amount of let's say, reciprocity, in which people get favors for being loyal, people are rewarded for being, faithful followers. So this happens in every political situation, and maybe in life in general. There are, some relationships that involve that, hierarchical relationships of protection and loyalty. I would say that it reaches a kind of threshold when it becomes pathological in a figure like Trump, which it did not reach in a figure like Obama. That, it was, I'm sure this is true, that he helped some of his subordinates, but no one, one of the things about, just to want to talk about Obama, there was no great corruption scandal during the Obama presidency. It's quite interesting. There was no major figure who then turned out to be lining his pockets. Whereas in Trump, we have the Manaforts and all these characters who were, getting money on the side or doing something that was basically corrupt. And Trump himself, one always got a sense that he was, using his properties for nefarious purposes. This is very different from Obama. So I would be a little careful before we efface the boundary between someone who really is a gangster racketeer type and someone who may involve, administration may have involved a certain amount of loyalty and a certain amount of reciprocity.
No, certainly. And you can even perhaps say, I guess, that Trump did a lot of things out of spite, it seemed. We're pulling out of the Iran deal, perhaps, or even climate change, things that he did just because he didn't like the predecessor or the people who were involved. Sam, I don't know if you have anything you want to ask about Freud or psychoanalysis, or should we?
No, not really. I think we covered. Yeah.
So I'm seeing, and one of the questions which I think our first question kind of touched on, what did critiques get really wrong? But since we have it here, I guess what you were really saying is that one of the main things that people get wrong about the Frankfurt School is trying to summarize all these thinkers and generations into one kind of like a soundbite piece. Is there anything else that you like to highlight? If not, you can just tell us a little bit about Erich Fromm and why he broke from the Institute.
Well, Fromm was, just to move quickly to that, Fromm's own attitude towards Freud was becoming more diluted. And if you have to think of a balance between the social and the psychological, between the cultural and the biological, Freud is somewhere, on both sides of that divide. There's a biological and naturalistic, we might say, side of Freud. There's even a book by a guy named Sulloway talks about him as a Darwinist. But Fromm was moving much more towards social analysis, in a way more faithful to the early marks of the manuscripts, the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844. The other members of the Frankfurt School were not so certain that this was the best way to go. And weirdly, in a way, for Marxists, they wanted to emphasize, and this is true of Adorno in particular, the importance of a kind of check on the social, the cultural, the historical, which was what we call nature. So that nature, it's often argued that Marxism was entirely on the side of the social, the historical, as against the natural, and that naturalization makes things permanent when they should be, in fact, seen as changeable. The Frankfurt School argued, no, there's also another version of nature, which is something that can't be fully and totally controlled by culture or the social, what is sometimes called the overly sociological description of the human, that we're nothing but the creatures of our society, nothing but the creatures of our culture, that there's no residue or substratum of something which is, if not transcendent, at least resistant to that culturalization. And critical theory saw Freud as holding on to that, let's say, kernel of the libidinal, the biological, the natural, the resistant, which Fromm basically let go. Fromm moved towards an overly culturalist version. And to some extent became a little bit too optimistic, therefore, from their point of view, about the possibilities of culturally affected change. There are other personal reasons. It's a complicated story that's never been, I think, fully told. But in any event, he was, he drifted away, moved in other directions. Then, of course, in the 1950s, the debate between Fromm and Marcuse first took place in the pages of Dissent, and then Marcuse included it in the appendix to Eros Civilization, pitted the Frankfurt School against what was called neo-orthodox revisionist psychoanalysis, Karen Horney and Harry Stack Sullivan along with Fromm. And this became a debate within, let's say, psychoanalytic or psychological circles, broadly speaking. Fromm's influence over the years has now diminished. I mean, there's some people who try to revive it. And the recent biography by Larry Friedman is quite good on Fromm. And there is an international Fromm society, and there are people who are Frommian practitioners. And, you know, I don't want to say Fromm is utterly forgotten, but his influence has diminished considerably from the time in the 1950s and 60s when his books were selling in the millions. I mean, books like The Art of Loving were incredible bestsellers at that period. By then, he had long since moved beyond the Frankfurt School. One interesting footnote to this, there's a recent book by Jack Jacobs on the Frankfurt School's attitude towards their own identity as Jews and towards Jewish issues in general. Very interesting, complicated question. And it turns out that Erich Fromm was the most anti-Zionist of all of them, that he was the one who identified mostly with the Palestinian causes in the 1940s and into the 50s, whereas the other members of the Frankfurt School were generally more ambivalent. You know, they weren't certainly supporters of, you know, say what was done in the West Bank or whatever, but they were very much interested in the role Israel played in protecting Jews against the second Holocaust, whereas Fromm was more motivated by hostility to nationalism, hostility to what he saw as, you know, Zionist incursion into the Middle East and the rights of the Palestinians. So that's another sort of footnote to the whole debate between them.
Okay, I see. Very interesting. Complete unaware of those. That was actually Sam who added that question, as well as the next one. So perhaps Sam, you'd better place to ask the next question, and if you want to also pick one or two more.
I mean, another person I would guess that he's not probably as well known as other people like Adorno and Marcuse is Löwenthal. I was wondering if you could just give a brief overview of his contribution to Frankfurt School and maybe a bit about his life, because he sounds like he was an extremely fun person as well, like in his personal life. He was really like living a full life, so to speak.
Well, Leo is the figure I knew best. He was a colleague at Berkeley for many years, and I became a close friend of his.
Oh, wow.
And I still, I mean, it's funny, this morning I got off an email with his widow, Susanna, who remains a close friend. We're going to have lunch in 2 weeks. So I have a special, I would say, fondness for Leo. I met first in 1968. And then when I came to Berkeley in 71, he was a mentor and a friend for many, many years until his death in 1993. His role in the school is very interesting. He's one of the earliest members, came in the middle 20s, was a sociologist basically of literature, high literature and low literature, popular culture, as well as, you know, writers like Goethe and Knut Hamsun and, you know, other great figures, Shakespeare and so forth. He played several roles. He was one of the central administrative figures. He was the editor of the Zeitschrift für Sozialforschung and did a great deal of work in the immense review columns that they published for the 10 or so years of the journal's existence. So he was one of the central organizers of that. Intellectually, in addition to the work he did on sociology of literature, and he published several books, Literature and the Image of Man, Literature, Popular Culture, and several other you know, essay collections. He also, with Norbert Guterman, was one of the contributors to the so-called Studies in Prejudice, and his volume was on techniques of the techniques, prophets of deceit, basically, techniques of demagoguery. And this was a book which did empirical work, qualitative analysis of the types of techniques used by anti-Semitic and other demagogues in America in the 1930s and 40s. And recently the book has been republished. There's a German translation, which Susanna Löwenthal, his widow, brought into being, which is very timely because these techniques are still the ones that are used by right-wing authoritarians today. So Leo's work has survived, I would say, the sociology literature, a little bit less so. Adorno was a flashier literary critic than Leo was, but the work on the demagogues, the work on techniques, the prophets of deceit, has had incredible resonance today. He was also, you know, a very powerful individual who, at Berkeley and elsewhere, was a kind of embodiment of the spirit of critical theory. without being a kind of guru of the New Left the way Marcuse was, but nonetheless much admired as a kind of, I would say, wise and prudent utopian, if I can use that kind of oxymoronic language. He maintained his strong belief in some of those utopian hedonistic impulses that I mentioned earlier, and yet was very shrewd, pragmatic, very much a kind of respected elder at Berkeley when I arrived. He was on, for example, the famous committee that looked at the student rebellion in 1964 and helped write the report that came out in the wake of that. So I can go on and on about Leo. He was, one of the most remarkable figures in my own life, and people who knew him had a great deal of admiration and affection for him.
Okay, so yeah, do you want to? Should I ask the next question or?
Sure. Since I did a lot of talking, I can go back when we asked about Adorno and perhaps romanticizing the past a bit. But yeah, do you want to ask the Marcuse questions a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I might have something there. Yeah. So I mean, you just mentioned Löwenthal was like viewed as a guru and stuff, but on the other hand, Marcuse was sort of a bit shunned, I believe, and he never managed to get a consistent job in universities, if I'm not mistaken, and stuff. How would you say his politics changed throughout his life, Marcuse? Because it seems that when Adorno and Horkheimer moved back to Germany, he had a slight, there was a bit of a split, and he moved in a different way. And there is a bit difference between like his books and his thought throughout his life, I would say.
Well, I think, first of all, we have to clarify his academic career in the United States. I mean, he was associated briefly with Columbia, the Russian research project at Columbia, where he wrote his book on Soviet Marxism, and then got a job at Brandeis in the philosophy department. And he was there for quite a while, but it is true that the president, Sacker, his name was, Abraham Sacker, was his opponent. And Marcuse's career was cut short. He was not allowed to stay after the official retirement age, but he then moved to a very successful final few years at the University of California in San Diego, where he had quite a number of both colleagues and students. So I would say he was not academically really an outsider. I mean, this is not a figure who couldn't get a job. Now, politically, it's interesting. Marcuse was always, in a way, very militant. In the 19-teens, he was involved in the German Revolution. He was, still, I would say, if not a fellow traveler, he was sympathetic to Leninism much longer than some of the others. And one can find in even the writings of the late 30s and 40s, moments in which he begins to talk the way more of a Leninist might. I mean, not by any means a Soviet apologist, but still in ways that suggest that he had not fully broken, let's say, with certain organizational models that the Leninists, the Bolshevik Revolution had created. In the 1960s, he became a public face of critical theory as a stimulant to non-traditional forces of resistance, what he called the Great Refusal, which meant a kind of widespread rejection of any type of complicity with a system that was basically corrupt. Now, the other Frankfurt School members, the ones who had gone back to Germany in particular, were more, we might say, complicit is the right word, but they certainly played a role within the system. Horkheimer was the chancellor for a while of the University of Frankfurt, Adorno, the director of the institute after a while. So they were establishment figures to a certain extent, and I don't want to overemphasize that. The students in Germany thought they had gone too far in that direction and were, for good or for bad reasons, hostile to what they saw as the betrayal of their more critical impulses. I mean, one has to really spend a lot of time unpacking what they did in post-war Germany to reestablish a decent, let's say, bourgeois democracy. This was not simply a given. And one could make a lot of noise about being further on the left, but the real task, in a way, was to free Germany of its Nazi past. And they did, a pretty good job in helping to do that. On radio and newspapers, they were involved in the public sphere. So that was their primary role. And, in the long run, I think they were successful. Now, whether or not they should have moved further to the left, they also had East Germany to deal with, and there was a kind of very explicit hostility to what was going on in East Germany, which was a Stalinist state. Now, as for Marcuse's politics, Marcuse was, as I say, always more militant, and sometimes went, from my perspective, too far in an anti-liberal, anti-pluralist direction. The most obvious example of that is his essay on repressive tolerance in the 1960s, which I've looked at recently again. It does not hold up. The basic argument of the essay is that there is truth and there is falsehood. The left has the truth, the right is basically ideological. And therefore, toleration for all ideas, including right-wing ideas, is a mistake. So the only ideas that should be tolerated are ideas which tell the truth, which are basically ideas of the left. Now, this is a highly, I would say, problematic assumption. First of all, that there's a single notion of truth in politics, something I've argued against, drawing a Hannah Arendt elsewhere, but also the idea that the left always has it, and the right never has anything on its side that is worth taking seriously. And this is the further assumption that there are mechanisms, let's call it the state or I don't know what, big tech, that has the wisdom to know the difference between the truth and falsehood, and then has the right to suppress false ideas. Now, boy, you get into an awful lot of trouble when you go in that direction. And so I always felt very uneasy with that. The last essay in Genesis and Validity is an essay on free speech. And, I try to argue about the teloses of free speech. And truth-telling is one of them, but there are many others as well, it seems to me. And I think Marcuse was a little bit simplistic in that essay in particular. So there was a time where his militant politics, I think, got him perhaps in a bit of trouble.
Just because I think this perfectly segues into your answer. Kam put it as, do you think that Marcuse and Adorno romanticized the past to an extent? I kind of want to modify that a bit. Don't you think the reason why they seem to have this idea that left had the right ideas or the correct ideas was like, it seems to me they were a bit sort of still idealistic, and this German idealism of Hegel and this idea of a perfect, end to a story. You know what I mean? Like, it feels to me like they seem to still harbor some idealism that sort of blinded them to their own subjectivity. I don't know if Kam wants to add something.
No, my question with romanticism was a tiny bit different, so I can come back to that. But just what you mentioned about Marcuse's last work, which seemed to have on repression, which seems to also get a lot of its criticism, what you said about the idea of there being one truth, that also resonates a lot with right now and some of the arguments that we hear about, there should be only this way or that way, that, there is a scientific truth, for instance, that the mainstream media with a lot of things say, and they try to censor everything else. It just made me think that also right now, that could also be a problematic idea, what he was saying in his last book. But sorry, back to Sam.
Well, these are immense questions. First on nostalgia or romanticization of the past. They were very explicit about not doing that. That is to say, they understood that modernity was complicated, that modernity brought with it many, many ills, and that there were, let's say, losses that were, that accompanied also the gains. But they never thought we could go back to an ideal earlier period. That there was something, let's say, in the medieval period or classical Rome or Greece or whatever. This was a standard against which we could measure the fall of humanity into something that was worse. So the dialectic of the Enlightenment meant both that the Enlightenment was not simply progress, but also that it had to be, to some extent, salvaged against the counter-Enlightenment, against the people who said, no, the Enlightenment was simply a loss of the age of faith or whatever. So they were very, very explicit about that. And they countered the nostalgia that one could see on the right, but also, a certain leftist nostalgia. Lukács, for example, at certain of his writings had a kind of nostalgia for the epic era of, Greece and so forth. So that they did not hold. However, having said that, they were also not celebrants of progress as if the past was always somehow benighted and needed to be left behind. So one had to read the past, this is, say, Walter Benjamin's great contribution, as a field of, let's say, debris of ruins that needed to be reconstellated in new ways that allowed the future to be nourished by aspects of the past that were still, in a sense, critical of the present. So this is a multi-temporality, and someone like Ernst Bloch, who was friendly with them in certain circumstances, not in others, would have called the non-synchronicity of the present, that there is a sense in which the present has residues of the past and emergent possibilities of the future, and all three are mixed up. And the past had moments of what Bloch called not yet utopianism, in which there was an anticipation of something which had not yet been achieved, but which were worth taking seriously as possibly to be achieved in the future. So just to speak to your point about Hegel. Now, the Frankfurt School is not necessarily Hegelian Marxist in any simple sense, but they took Hegel very seriously. And Adorno in particular, his 3 essays on Hegel, 3 studies of Hegel, talked about aspects of Hegel which needed to be preserved. And the dialectical method, even though not positive, was one of them. He wanted to use it in a negative dialectical way. But what he said at one point, which is quite fascinating, my lead essay in Genesis of Validity, I draw on this. He said that we should not always judge the past by current standards. We should not always appreciate a figure like Hegel or a figure like Nietzsche or a figure like Marx or Freud according to what we think is right. That we should not apply our standards, but in fact, often judge the present by the standards of the past. That we should judge ourselves in terms of what Hegel had hoped for, judge ourselves in terms of maybe what Marx had hoped for. That the past somehow had values, norms, even practices that maybe are superior to our own. Now, it doesn't mean in every respect, it doesn't mean we should recover the past as it once supposedly was. That would be idealistically romantic in the wrong way. But we shouldn't say that the cutting edge of the present is the sole standard. And this, in a way, speaks to the issue, for example, of the current cancel culture when it comes to figures in the past who may not live up to our standards of righteousness in the present. That we sometimes have to understand them as flawed, but also understand ourselves as flawed. And so I always went, I used to tell my students that, look, in the year 2200, when everybody is a vegan, they're going to say, hey, this guy Martin Luther King used to eat meat. We have to cancel him. That everything he stood for was garbage because he still ate meat. And so we had to be very careful about that kind of presentist attitude towards figures in the past who may have something to teach us. So this is not romanticization. It's not nostalgia. It's a more complicated attitude about the relationship between past, present, and future, which I think has much to teach us.
What about do you think there is a bit of an idealization of what humans can achieve, or humanity as a whole? As in this, in replacing God with humans in a way that sort of enlightenment?
Well, this is a good point. I mean, the simple replacement of some version of absolute either power or goodness or creativity, which we used to attribute to the divinity, the absolute replacement of that with a human version was something they much rejected, partly because it meant the domination of nature. It meant anthropomorphic apotheosis, that somehow the human was superior to the animal, was superior to the natural inorganic world, that humans were like gods, and they were very much opposed to that. So there's a kind of, let's say, humility in the Frankfurt School attitude towards the place of the human, the larger totality of being. They often talked about the animal. I mean, Derrida, other people have made us very aware of the fact that humans are not only animals, but our relationship to animals is a mark to a certain extent of our normative, ethical self-consciousness, that we have to avoid being utterly and completely self-assertive when it comes to the animal kingdom. And the Frankfurt School was way ahead of the game on this. They understood that our relations to animals was, in fact, very, very important, and that the domination of the animal world was a short step to the domination of other humans, who were often treated as if they were nothing but animals. So they were, I would say, not pessimistic, but realistic about the limits of subjective self-aggrandizement. And Adorno in particular talked, in fact, about the primacy of the object as opposed to the primacy of the subject. So the idea of the constitutive subject, the subject that was epistemically dominant, the subject that could basically assert itself, a narcissistic subject, meta-narcissistic, we might say the human species as a subject, was something they were very explicit in contesting. So there is in their work, I wouldn't call it pessimism, but an awareness of the limits that the human, even at its most, let's say, utopian, could ever achieve.
So yes, I mean, Sam, I don't know if you had any
Thank
follow-ups there.
No,
but yeah, I just wanted to say your point about is very well taken. The one about judging people in the context of their time, and especially with Adorno and Marcuse, it seems to be very important where they came from in Germany, the time that was, and all that, which impacted the way of their thinking. But with the good old deism and the nostalgia, my point was, I think, even much more simple, and that's I just wanted to ask you as well, is that, for instance, I found that they compare, Adorno compares some of the current music and some of the current artwork to some of the best artwork that had happened in the past, such as Beethoven and Mozart and these kind of musical pieces. So that was the one I was thinking that, is it fair to say that perhaps there was quite a bit of subjectivity? Of course, there's a lot of subjectivity in everything we do. That's not what I'm saying, but perhaps overly subjective in Adorno's work and while he was talking about art. And also, yes, is it fair, and is that not nostalgia in the way he would compare contemporary work at the time with some of the best works that have been done historically in the field of arts and music?
Well, this is a big, I mean, we would have to focus on Adorno's, let's say, narrative of music to make sense of that argument. I mean, first of all, Adorno was clearly interested in the cutting edge of esoteric music rather than popular music, and perhaps was far too quick to distinguish between high and low. Not always, and not in every respect, but in ways that make some of us uncomfortable. But if we stick with this narrative of high music or classical music or Western classical music, because he wasn't interested much in music outside the West, this was not simply an analysis in which the past was superior to the present. For example, he wrote very specifically against the cult of Bach, a very famous essay on Bach and his devotees, in which he argues against an attempt to return to Bach as if it were somehow the source of all great music. Not that he didn't love Bach, but nonetheless he was opposed to the nostalgia cult of Bach. When it came to the classical music of Mozart, Haydn, and Beethoven, he understood their work as representing the height of a certain moment in bourgeois culture, with Beethoven in particular. But he also understood that this was crumbling already from within by the time that moment was passing. So Beethoven's one of his last works, the Missa Solemnis, is what he called Adorno called his alienated masterpiece, was a work which already had departed from the high point of Beethoven's work and foreshadowed a kind of decline in Western music, which Wagner, among others, represented. Now, he identified also most clearly, and he was part of this group, with the Second Vienna School, with Schoenberg, with Berg, with Webern, and others, and wrote music himself. And so he thought that the atonal revolution of the early 20th century was perhaps the highest, if we want to use that word, or the most intense point of the musical expression of the crisis of Western culture. He did not like, however, Schoenberg's turn to the 12-tone row, which he saw as a restoration of a certain kind of forced order. So he liked, if you want to say the high point of his musical narrative would be the atonal music of the early Schoenberg, maybe Weber and other figures from that era. Now, when it came to contemporary music, let's say classical music, he did talk about the decay of the avant-garde and talked about what they called musique informelle during the 1950s and 60s. So there were some figures he liked, others he didn't like. It's a very complicated story. He's hostile, for example, to Stravinsky and so forth. So one would be very, remiss to say that Adorno was nostalgic for classical music. He saw it in a very discrete ways. Now, what he did not do was to see in popular music much that he could admire. So in his attack on jazz, he was insensitive, we might say, to what became in certain circles a kind of avant-garde jazz, the jazz we associate, I don't know, say Coltrane or Miles Davis, but he never wrote about them. He was writing about popular culture. And he's very easy to be attacked for that negligence. Whether or not this is nostalgia or just insensitivity or his own, let's say, limitations in terms of his preferences is hard to say. Now, as for subjectivity, this is a very vexed question because it's quite clear that he had his own tastes and his own preferences. And people like Richard Taruskin, my colleague at Berkeley, have always been very hostile to him, partly because of his, let's say, hostility to Russian music or American music and his emphasis on the German canon as the high point of Western music. So, there are various ways in which his own subjectivity did play a role. But Adorno was also extremely careful to try to limit the role of the subject. I mentioned before the predominance of the object. So he's very aware of the issue of subjectivity, let's put it that way, very aware of the role that interpretation plays, the role the critic's own cultural, let's say, situatedness plays. And it's very difficult to reduce what he did to a simple, let's say, subjective preference or preference for his taste. A lot more is going on, and it doesn't do justice to the complexity to make it simply a question of, I like this, you like that, he was prejudiced, I'm not, and so forth. I think that doesn't really get at the nub of what makes him interesting.
No, certainly. That was very interesting. And about Bach, I believe he had a very interesting headline about what its admirers get wrong or something like that. So I guess that definitely disproves a lot the point I was making. Perhaps the last question I have, and I don't know if Sam has any other ones, but this again also could come back with us judging their work with a lot more information that we have 7 years later, which is that, I mean, during their time, there was a literature around media and communication and the impact of media being developed during that time. But since then, I think it has become much more nuanced and there's less direct power perhaps associated to the media as there were during that time. But do you think still Adorno, because I know during that time there were still studies going on, did they give too much? Did they believe that the media has and art and all this has a bit too much power, would you say?
Well, this is also, you're absolutely right. This is an ongoing issue. We're still struggling with it. I mean, the notion of the so-called culture industry, which they develop in Dialectic of Enlightenment, emphasizes the fact that consumer preferences are far less important than the way consumers are manipulated by an industry that knows what's going to make money, generate hits, that knows how to make movies that people like, that basically is out there not to make people truly informed or even to create real happiness, but rather pseudo happiness, which then produces popularity and big bucks. Now, we have in our current media landscape, and I'm not an expert in this, God knows, and we're all immersed in it with a varying amount to understand on, a different situation in the sense that there's much more, we might say, input from below. Much more, I mean, things like this podcast. And, 50 years ago, this couldn't have existed. So we now have what we might call democratization of the means of production when it comes to the media. Having said that, we also know that there are lots of monopolies that occur with, technology, and the companies that give us, Google and Yahoo and, Microsoft and so forth, we're worried about big tech and worried about the role big tech plays. So the idea of concentration, although the web is decentralized and seems to allow input from everywhere, the loss of any sort of vetting mechanism, is counterbalanced by the fact that we're all, in a kind of subterranean way, controlled by the algorithms that mean that when I go online, they will immediately direct me towards products that I've been interested in the past or videos that I've looked at in the past. There's a way in which we're being surveilled from above through the media, the way in which we're being manipulated in covert ways. So, there's both a meta-awareness of this and also a kind of naivete about how much actual, let's say, autonomy we have. So the same issues are there. It's not the culture industry in the way that they understood it with, big studios in Hollywood in the 1940s, but big tech also has the potential to manipulate us in similar ways. So I think that some of their insights are still valuable, although, mutatis mutandis, and we've had lots of things that have changed since then. And there are a lot of serious media communications people who do work that's informed by critical theory, but also has transcended some of its earlier assumptions.
Yes, certainly. I think with Sam, we always have these kind of debates where I think I fall more on your side with the impact that the media can have, although not going as far as perhaps Adorno. Sam, I don't know if you wanted to add anything. It's really been a great interview and talking to you. Thank you so much, Martin. You go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, thank you. Just to clarify for myself, do you feel like overall, like Adorno implies that the media, the culture industry is a sort of a side effect of capitalism, or is it an important part of keep it going, like a crucial element in subduing the masses or whatever? Like that's my sort of contention, that I think they put too much sort of attention on its active role as a thing, rather than just the side effect.
Well, I don't know how we would, adjudicate that, how we would measure, what was dominant and what isn't. I mean, I think you're right, that they did feel that capitalism survived partly through state capitalist manipulation of the economy. I mean, they got that from Frederick Pollock. So the economy was not creating a crisis automatically the way Marxism had expected. But also there was a relative, let's say, dampening of discontent through the bread and circuses produced by the culture industry, which, was not controlled by some sort of evil cabal of conspirators, but which operated automatic pilot, we might say, through certain values and institutions to divert people, to make people consoled through false satisfactions or through immediate gratifications, which created demand. I mean, there's no question that the culture industry understood how to create demand for products. And that this was, one of the ways in which capitalism survived well into the 20th century, and we might argue into the 21st. Whether or not it was the mechanism, whether or not there are other mechanisms as well, this is obviously a question that we could still ask. But without it, it's hard to imagine that, capitalism would have prospered and continued to do, I mean, people often talk about late capitalism. It used to be a phrase that people heard all the time, late capitalism. But I think it was Russell Jacoby who once said, the problem with capitalism, it's not late enough. So that in a way, it survives, it continues to thrive. The real transition, it's an amazing, ironic twist of history. In the 1920s, when the Frankfurt School began, the transition that they talked about was from capitalism to socialism. And they wondered about how the Soviet Union would be a model for that transition. In the 21st century, the transition has gone in the opposite direction, with China being the great example. How do you move from socialism to capitalism? Now, whether or not that's a good thing for the Chinese people, it certainly has been a success. If you go to China today, as I've done several times of late, this is an amazing transformation of a culture that 50 years ago was a basket case. So, whether or not you like it or not, this is the transition of the 21st century. So capitalism has found a way not to be late. It's still thriving, and with all of its crises, it's going to be around for a hell of a long time. For good or for ill.
No, certainly. Okay, thank you so much, Martin. Thank you for being so generous with your time. It's been an absolute pleasure listening to you, and I look forward to listening to this interview after to properly digest it. Anything else that perhaps you would like to say, or Sam, anything else?
Your new book is fantastic as well. I don't know if you had any few words on, just started it, but so I don't have anything to say, but yeah, if you wanted to add something.
Well, this is a book also, recent essays that deal with the theory and practice of intellectual history. There's not much Frankfurt School in it, but I'm by professional deformation an historian of intellectuals and ideas, and intellectual history is an extremely interesting field, it seems to me, and I try to deal with some of the recent figures, Quentin Skinner, Hayden White, even older ones like Isaiah Berlin, and also to try to show how it can illuminate certain issues like free speech or the heroism of modern life. I want to say on that. So, I think people who are interested in critical theory might find some stimulation in these essays, and thanks for mentioning it.
Oh, there's a great chapter on Walter Benjamin and Eyes
Right.
of Berlin. So, yeah,
Right.
if
Thanks.
anybody, I automatically went there.
Yeah, that was fun to write. That was Benjamin and Berlin is two distinct types, which I tried to understand through the metaphorics of style. So, in particular, the ones that I look at are Berlin's notion of the hedgehog and the fox. There are others like the husband and lover that Susan Sontag introduces, the gambler and the investor, jester and priest. Lots of different ways in which intellectuals have been metaphorically typified. And I think this is one of the tools that intellectual history can profitably use.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much again, Martin. And yes, thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks for the opportunity. Be well.